With you on two, Neil.
Good morning. This is Mission Control Houston on Tuesday, August 6th, 2019.
And 1.602 Cygnus Departure monitoring.
Copy, we're go for step one, departure monitoring.
We are live here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room with a live view of Northrop Grumman Cygnus cargo vehicle in the grasp of the Canadarm2 robotic arm. This morning, we're bringing you live coverage of the release and departure of Cygnus from the International Space Station. Today's release is being controlled by ground controllers here in Mission Control Houston. Teams here are being led today by Flight Director Judd Freeling. He's joined on his console to his right by Capcom Neil Nagata. You'll hear calls from Capcom to the station crew from time to time today as teams go through the procedures for Cygnus release. Today's visiting vehicle officer is Thomas Castleberry. He'll be communicating directly with Northrop Grumman's flight controllers in Dulles, Virginia, relaying vehicle status and updates back to teams here in Mission Control Houston. And leading the teams in Dulles, Virginia is Northrop Grumman Mission Director Paul Brower. Teams in Dulles are keeping tabs on the Cygnus vehicle and will take over full control of the spacecraft once it's crossed over the approach ellipsoid. The approach ellipsoid serves as a mythical cone around the station that's referred to as the neighborhood. So once Cygnus departs the neighborhood this morning, joint operations will end and Northrop Grumman teams will take full control of the spacecraft.
You're ready for release and departure.
Teams here in Mission Control Houston just finished a final go, no-go poll, and we just heard from...
Go for Cygnus release on time at 16:15 GMT, steps 2 through 4 in 1.320. A reminder, the release window closes at 17:23 GMT.
Copy all, Neil. Go for on-time release.
And we now have confirmation that Cygnus is a go for an on-time release today. The release window is set to open up around 11:11 a.m. Central Time today, putting Cygnus on track for an on-time release around 11:15 a.m. Central Time this morning. Earlier today, flight controllers here in Mission Control Houston used the space station's Canadarm2 robotic arm to unbolt Cygnus from the Earth-facing port of the station's Unity module and maneuvered the vehicle into its release position where it sits now. Cygnus's journey to the International Space Station began on April 17th when the spacecraft launched from the Wallops Flight Facility in Florida. The Antares rocket lifted off to the International Space Station carrying about 7,600 pounds of science, research, crew supplies, and vehicle hardware. Cygnus arrived to its capture point 2 days later on April 19th with NASA astronaut Anne McLean at the controls of the Canadarm2 robotic arm for capture as David St. Jacques of the Canadian Space Agency backed her up and monitored systems. A few hours after capture, Cygnus was installed to the Earth-facing port of the station's Unity module where it stayed for 109 days. Each spacecraft is named after influential individuals in the world of spaceflight, and the Cygnus spacecraft for this station resupply mission is dedicated to Roger Chaffee. Chaffee and his crewmates Gus Grissom and Ed White lost their lives on January 27, 1967 in the Apollo 1 fire on the launch pad at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Chaffee was part of the third group of astronauts selected by NASA in 1963. Again, we're standing by now waiting for confirmation that the release window is open, which should happen around 11:11 a.m. Central Time today. After that, there will be a couple milestones. After Cygnus is released, the first milestone comes when Cygnus departs the keep-out sphere, which is an invisible line about 200 meters from the International Space Station. After Cygnus departs the keep-out sphere, the next milestone will be when it exits the approach ellipsoid, or the neighborhood of the station. Once Cygnus exits the neighborhood, joint operations will end and Northrop Grumman teams will take full control of the spacecraft. Our coverage will end there, but its mission won't. Within 24 hours of its release, Cygnus will begin its secondary mission, deploying a series of CubeSats. Once it's a safe distance away from the station, 2 deployment systems will begin deploying the first in a series of small technology demonstration satellites. And after about a month of free flight operations, NASA's Seeker robotic external CubeSat inspection vehicle will be deployed and operations will begin to demonstrate its ability to maneuver around Cygnus and take high-resolution photos. Seeker will then transmit those images to its Kenobi receiver inside Cygnus for storage and transmission to the ground at a later date. After orbiting Earth for about 4 months of system test and nanosat deployment, Cygnus will end its journey disposing of nearly 5,400 pounds of trash during its fiery re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean on December 11th. We're in a short handover period right now between satellites, but we should be regaining communications here in a little bit. Again, we're standing by for that release window to open, which is slated for around 11:11 a.m. Central Time this morning. We're about 4 minutes out right now. And we've regained communications right now. As you can see, Cygnus is still sitting at the end of the Canadarm2 robotic arm. The view we're getting now is a view of what's called the Cuckoo workstation inside the cupola on board the International Space Station. This is the same view that Expedition 60 flight engineers Nick Hague and Christina Koch of NASA are getting now as they monitor systems and back up ground controllers here in Mission Control Houston. Hague is at the controls of the robotic arm today, backed up by Koch. Hague and Koch launched alongside Alexei Ovchinin of Roscosmos on March 14th from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Hague is nearing the end of his time aboard the International Space Station, with his return home scheduled for October 3rd. While Koch is nearing the halfway mark of her long-duration mission, Koch will remain on board the International Space Station conducting research, station maintenance, vehicle operations, and spacewalks until her return home is scheduled for February 2020. Once her mission concludes, she will have spent nearly a year in orbit as part of 3 expeditions. Again, standing by for that release window to open. We're about a minute out. And we just received confirmation the release window is now open. With that release window now open, everything is still on track for an on-time release around 11:15 a.m. Central Time today. We're about 2 minutes out now from the scheduled release time. We're less than a minute out. And release has been confirmed at 11:15 a.m. Central as Cygnus and the International Space Station were flying 260 statute miles over the Pacific Ocean. We're getting a live view from the Canadarm2 as Cygnus is now backing away from the International Space Station. Now standing by for confirmation that Cygnus has started its 3-minute departure burn, which will move the spacecraft a safe distance away from the station. Another view from the Canadarm2 as Cygnus continues to back off.
And Houston Station on 2, Cygnus Departure commanded.
And Houston copies, we see it. Station Houston on 2 for Cygnus. Cygnus departure burn is in progress. Continue to monitor departure, steps 2 and 3 in 1.602.
We copy, Neil.
And that was Capcom Neil Nagata confirming the spacecraft's 3-minute burn is underway. Again, this burn will move Cygnus a safe distance away from the station, crossing over the approach ellipsoid, which serves as a mythical cone around the station, considered the neighborhood of the International Space Station. Once Cygnus departs the neighborhood, Northrop Grumman teams will take full control of the spacecraft for it to begin its secondary mission of system test and nanosat deployments spanning over 4 months. About 2 minutes left in this 3-minute burn, and ground controllers here in Mission Control Houston are reporting performance is nominal so far. One minute left in the departure burn. 30 seconds left in the departure burn. And we have confirmation the departure burn is now complete.
And Houston Station on 2 for Cygnus Departure. Steps 2 and 3 complete. RWS is safe.
Copy, RWS safe.
And we have confirmation Cygnus is now outside the keep-out sphere.
And Station Houston on 2, the Cygnus has exited the 200-meter keep-out sphere.
Copies.
And that was Capcom Neil Nagata confirming Cygnus is now outside the keep-out sphere. Again, the keep-out sphere is one of the milestones built into Cygnus Departure today. Cygnus has now completed 2 milestones so far, with its release from the Canadarm2 robotic arm at 11:15 a.m. Central Time, as the International Space Station and Cygnus were flying 260 statute miles above the Pacific Ocean. It then conducted a 3-minute departure burn to move a safe distance away from the station, and Cygnus is now headed toward the final milestone of the day, the approach ellipsoid. Once Cygnus crosses over the approach ellipsoid today, out of the vicinity of the International Space Station, joint operations will end and Northrop Grumman teams will take full control of the spacecraft. Until then, NASA astronauts Nick Hague and Christina Koch will continue to monitor systems from the cupola on board the International Space Station. Later today, Cygnus will conduct a pair of engine firings to raise its altitude about 40 miles higher than the station, putting it at the correct altitude to begin deploying a series of CubeSats. Once it's a safe distance away from the station, 2 deployment systems will begin deploying the first in a series of small technology demonstration satellites, and after about a month of free flight, NASA's Seeker robotic external CubeSat inspection vehicle will be deployed, and operations will begin to demonstrate its ability to maneuver around Cygnus and take high-resolution photos. Seeker will then transmit those photos to its Kenobi receiver inside Cygnus for storage and transmission to the ground at a later date. Cygnus will remain in orbit until later this year to serve as a technical test bed, demonstrating its ability to support payloads on the cargo craft for extended durations. Again, Cygnus has now completed 2 milestones so far, starting with its release from the Canadarm2 robotic arm at 11:15 a.m. Central Time, as the International Space Station and Cygnus were flying 260 statute miles above the Pacific Ocean. It then conducted a 3-minute departure burn to move a safe distance away from the station, and Cygnus is now headed toward the final milestone of the day, the approach ellipsoid. This mission actually started as a notable one before launch when Northrop Grumman demonstrated its new load capability before launch. Previously, all cargo had to be loaded around 4 days prior to launch, but the new capability used for this mission allowed for time-sensitive science experiments to be loaded into Cygnus just 24 hours before liftoff. Using that new load capability, Cygnus delivered about 7,600 pounds of science, research, crew supplies, and vehicle hardware to the International Space Station on April 17th. Of that 7,600 pounds of cargo was about 3,500 pounds of science investigations. One notable science investigation sent up on this mission was Rodent Research. This was the first flight for Rodent Research to be flown on a Cygnus spacecraft. Spaceflight is known for having a dramatic influence on immune response, but there's little research on its effect following an actual challenge to the body's immune system. Using a mouse model makes this possible, as the mouse immune system closely parallels to that of humans. A good portion of research sent up on these resupply missions is dedicated to understanding how the human body adapts and thrives in microgravity. There's also a great deal of parallels between health challenges in space and different ailments back here on Earth, with some space-based treatments translating directly to helping people here on Earth. The International Space Station continues to serve as an essential testbed for people on Earth and in orbit as we continue to move forward, placing the first woman and next man on the Moon by 2024 and eventually onto Mars. The International Space Station is currently flying over the Atlantic Ocean. Again, Cygnus was released from the Canadarm2 robotic arm at 11:15 a.m. Central Time as the International Space Station and Cygnus were flying 260 statute miles above the Pacific Ocean. Cygnus is now heading toward the final milestone of the day to cross over the approach ellipsoid. Again, once Cygnus crosses over the approach ellipsoid out of the vicinity of the International Space Station, joint operations will end and Northrop Grumman teams will take full control of the spacecraft. Again, standing by for Cygnus to cross over the approach ellipsoid, which is planned for about 3 minutes from now at 11:36 a.m. Central Time. And we have confirmation that Cygnus has now exited the approach ellipsoid a little bit ahead of schedule.
And Station Houston on Spacecraft 2 for Cygnus.
You on 2?
All right, Nick. Cygnus has exited the approach ellipsoid.
With that, Neil, Cygnus is out of the approach ellipsoid.
And that was Capcom Neil Nagata confirming Cygnus is now outside the approach ellipsoid, meaning Cygnus has now left the vicinity of the space station.
Station Huntsville on Space to Ground 2 for Drew at your convenience. We need about 5 minutes of your time for some help with VFS.
Again, Cygnus is now outside of the approach ellipsoid, and this is the point where joint operations end and Northrop Grumman teams will take full control of the spacecraft. Recapping the events from today, earlier this morning, flight controllers here in Mission Control Houston used the space station's Canadarm2 robotic arm to unbolt Cygnus from the Earth-facing port of the station's Unity module and maneuvered the vehicle into its release position. With Nick Hague at the controls of the Canadarm2 backed up by Christina Koch, Cygnus was set free at 11:15 a.m. Central Time as the International Space Station and Cygnus were flying 260 statute miles over the Pacific Ocean. Cygnus then conducted a 3-minute departure burn.
With you on 2, Neil.
Cygnus then conducted a 3-minute departure burn to move a safe distance away from the station. Seconds after the departure burn ended, Cygnus exited the keep-out sphere about 200 meters away from the International Space Station. The final milestone came just minutes ago when Cygnus crossed over the approach ellipsoid, leaving the neighborhood of the station where joint operations ended and Northrop Grumman teams took full control of the spacecraft. Later today, Cygnus will conduct a pair of engine firings to raise its altitude about 40 miles higher than the station, putting it at the correct altitude to begin deploying a series of CubeSats. Once it's a safe distance away from the station, 2 deployment systems will begin deploying the first in a series of small technology demonstration satellites, and after about a month of free flight operations, NASA's Seeker robotic external CubeSat inspection vehicle will be deployed, and operations will begin to demonstrate its ability to maneuver around Cygnus and take high-resolution photos. Seeker will transmit those photos to its Kenobi receiver inside Cygnus for storage and transmission to the ground at a later date. And Cygnus will remain in orbit until later this year to serve as a technical test bed, demonstrating its ability to support payloads on the cargo craft for extended durations. After Cygnus orbits the Earth for 4 months of system test and nanosat deployments, Cygnus will end its journey disposing of nearly 5,400 pounds of trash during its fiery re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean on December 11th. With Cygnus now safely departed from the vicinity of the International Space Station after its 109-day stay, that'll wrap up our release coverage for today. This is Mission Control Houston.